And welcome to another episode of Mysterious Forces Live. I'm at the 2019 International UFO Convention here in Phoenix, Arizona. And this is part 2 of the Bitmovio episode that we started yesterday with the creators of the platform. And my guest today is Rizwan Virk, and he's also part of the team and one of the creators of Bitmovio. And he's also an author who's written a book called The Simulation Hypotheses. And you've probably heard him on Fade to Black with Jimmy Church. And he's here to talk about his book after we finish our conversation about the new platform, Bitmovio. And I know that I gave an introduction to what the platform is about yesterday, but as I interpret the information, the best way to think about this is it's kind of like YouTube meets Patreon, where there are no minimum subscriber lists before you can monetize. Content creators are not censored, and they can get donations from their subscribers and viewers right away without meeting some crazy minimum standard for viewership. And we've been talking a lot about independent content creators, especially here in the alternative research community, and how YouTube is starting to marginalize independent content creators because they want to make it, in my opinion, more like Netflix, and they just want to monetize for big corporate money. And we've all been talking amongst ourselves about needing another platform that will compete against YouTube, that will allow content creators to be uncensored and to talk about whatever content they want, as long as it's culturally appropriate, not illegal, so on and so forth. So I'd like to pick up where we left off with Riz. And yesterday we had just kind of talked about the basics of how the platform itself makes money and how the user can avoid the advertisements because the website itself, the platform, gets 20% of what the content creators create. But that's a lot more of an honest deal than what YouTube is getting, because YouTube won't release their data numbers to the content creators and only allow them so much money. And of course, everyone knows that YouTube is playing the monetization game. And you had a different take on what the platform does and how it was created. So I'd like to just pass off the microphone to you and give you a chance to talk to the viewers and kind of, from your point of view, explain the platform and how this is a game changer in social media content.
Sure, absolutely. So, we created Bitmovio to have a censor-free platform so that independent content creators could have a way to interact directly with consumers. And too often when you've got a middleman like YouTube or Netflix or Amazon, you're not really privy to all of the data, as you said. So you don't really know how much they're charging an advertiser, for example. They could be taking 80% and you could be getting 20%. Whereas we do it the other way. The content creator gets 80%. And, I was involved in the mobile gaming world, so we've done a lot with Apple and iTunes and Google. And so we came out of that world where they took a flat 70%, or they kept 30%, and they gave the game developers 70%. And we wanted to do something like that was very upfront about what content creators are getting. But more than that, we're seeing more and more users want to watch free content, right? And so how do we work it out so that the users can have what they want, which is free content, but content creators still want to be able to earn money for their content? And so we came up with this gamification model using virtual currency. So what happens is if you log into Bitmovio and you watch a video, any free video, you actually earn virtual currency. Just like you might in World of Warcraft or Fortnite or any of these different video games that are out there. You can then take that currency and you can reward your favorite content creators. So you can say, I'd like to tip, this content creator, I'd like to give Jimmy Church at Fade to Black so many points, I'd like to give, UFO Mania so many points, etc. And so you're like an allocator of your time and attention. So depending on where you allocated your time, that's how you earned the virtual currency, and then the virtual currency can then be exchanged for cryptocurrency or real money by the content creators. So essentially, you can create free content without having to have ads, and there's a monetization mechanism that's built right into the platform itself. So that's really what Bitmovio is all about.
That's awesome. So how did you come up with the idea? Were you just looking at the problems that YouTube is having and just come up with an alternative to compete? Because, this seems to cover the gaps between Patreon and YouTube and puts everything all in one location. And I can see how convenient that is, because one by one, I have colleagues that have shows. And once YouTube changed the algorithm and changed the rules, then suddenly everyone's got a Patreon channel. And I think it makes a lot more sense to keep it all in one place.
Yeah, we like to have that integrated model, because if you're, having videos on YouTube and then you're getting people to support you on Patreon, and we like to think of it as a mix between YouTube, Netflix, and Patreon, right? So it's a way to support content creators, and they might be streamers or they might be actual, films. So, for example, just this week we announced a deal with The Orchard from Sony. So all of their UFO documentaries, like, Bob Lazar in Area 51, Renegade with David Icke, and many others, will be on Bitmovio very soon. So you can watch free videos, and then you can turn around and pay for the paid content as well. So yeah, we came up with the idea of having it integrated, and also we wanted something that was very open. So we were looking at blockchain and Bitcoin and how cryptocurrency works, where there's no centralized authority. Everyone just agrees. And we saw what was happening with YouTube demonetizing so many different channels. I mean, these are well-known channels with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of subscribers, and suddenly, just because you had a UFO in the algorithm, in the text somewhere, the algorithm demonetized you and you had to go and appeal. And so we were looking at blockchain in a decentralized model, and that's really, I wrote an article called How Blockchain Could Kill Netflix and Hollywood and cable, and then we looked at the YouTube model and realized that was really a nice sweet spot for us. And so we also do science fiction and fantasy in addition to paranormal content. So there's a show that's on the CW called The Outpost, probably the first network show that's currently on the air that's also on a blockchain-based platform. But our sweet spot is very much paranormal, mystery, UFO type of content. That's what we're finding many of our users are, and where many of our content creators are as well.
I was wondering if you could speak to gaming and gaming culture, because not only do we cover paranormal stuff, but I also cover movies and music and different genres within that. And so there's artistic stuff on the show as well. And I strongly support geek culture. So I'm just wondering if you would tell folks a little bit about the gaming aspects, because I know there's a lot of gamers out there.
Yeah, so, there's a lot of people in the gaming world. You've got, 200 million people watching esports competitions now, and, video games are taking more and more time away from traditional TV and traditional media. And so, I spent a lot of time in gaming. I run a startup accelerator at MIT where we teach people how to build video games and also how to get their games out there into the marketplace, and how to get users for the games as well. So that's another part of Bitmovio is, so if you think of it, we have three broad categories: paranormal, sci-fi, fantasy, and then gaming is one of the other categories. And so I spent a lot of time, in the esports world and with streamers, and they're on places like Twitch. And Twitch also has certain thresholds, beyond you need to be at to really monetize. And it's very hard for somebody starting out to really make any money off on Twitch. And so with Bitmovio, we've got a built-in virtual currency model that is there right from the start. And so, I am an investor in many startups that have worked with Twitch streamers as well. And so we think video games is a great way to think about movies. And what we're really doing at Bitmovio is, in fact, we're turning content into a video game, if you think of it. It's a video, and in fact, that's the subject of my book as well, which is this idea that we're all living inside a video game. So, you may have heard a famous venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, Mark Andreessen. He said that, software is eating the world. Well, I like to say video games are eating the world, because it's become the new lens through which we can really understand, everything in the world around us.
Right. No, I totally agree. I had touched on this with the rest of your team yesterday, and I'll ask you, and I don't want to get too deep into controversy. I'm not trying to create a controversy where there is none, but as a person who loves using these platforms, do you have a plan for sidestepping some of the social controversies that plague Twitter and plague YouTube over, content, and I know that it's an uncensored platform, but obviously you have to draw a line somewhere with illegal content or sexually inappropriate content, so on and so forth. And I don't do politics left or right on my show. We don't discuss politics. But at the same time, we know that politics in general is very divisive for people, and that's part of what is plaguing Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, is this fight between different political ideologies going against each other, and some claiming unfair representation across the spectrum. So how do you plan to police any of those controversies that might crop up when you have content creators? Like, you know, I mean, you just have to ask, what happens if somebody wants to put some white nationalist content on your platform, and what was your plan going into that, and where do you draw the line with that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, of course, this is a big issue on many different platforms, and you know, there's a fine line between making sure content is appropriate and censorship, and we're trying to, you know, walk that fine line. Because, you know, we have guidelines, so certainly anything that's illegal we don't allow on the platform. Also, we don't allow porn on the platform, although certainly, you know, you could have a separate site that's just dedicated to that. And so, you know, if anyone violates our guidelines, you know, we'll not have them on the platform. That said, beyond that, we try not to censor too much, but certainly anything that's illegal or hate speech, you know, we're not in favor of that. I'm particularly sensitive myself to, you know, racial types of issues, and that's not something we'd want to have on the site when you get into white nationalists. But too often the white nationalist stuff gets confused with, you know, UFO and conspiracy. and so we're very open to the UFO and conspiracy side of it. We just don't want any racism or any hate speech, you know, on the site. But unlike, you know, say YouTube, where you've got these algorithms that are just catching everybody, you know, we're very careful about that, so that we're only stopping stuff that's really clearly beyond the line, you know. Right. Yeah, so that's and when it comes to politics itself, you know, we try to keep out of the political debate. Right. But we, you know, we're happy if we have commentators and streamers who are liberal, you know, who are sort of, you know, love light and healing with crystals, or people that are very right-wing, you know. Pro-Trump and into the conspiracy world. We're open to all of that, okay. You know.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'm very anti-censorship myself. As I've said on my show many times, in my interpretation of the First Amendment, if you're not supporting speech that deeply offends you, then you don't understand the First Amendment, because when you start with what offends any individual, it's going to be applied across the board to all of us, and we all lose free speech. So you have to be willing to accept what is offensive in the bigger world, but I see these social media platforms as different because it can get out of hand. And, you know, I guess people who use these platforms think about this these days, because too often, as of the last year or so, Twitter is in the news a lot, and it's a lot more about how they police their content rather than some new thing that Twitter has. And that's not the kind of news or the kind of growth that any social media platforms, I would think. But anyway, there's that. I just like to ask those questions because, you know, this impacts society. When you create this platform, you're creating a community. And I guess I want to talk about the awareness of creating a community where people are going to come together, and where your responsibility starts and stops in that creation.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, we're very aware of that. And we're, you know, there's a lot of content on the site that I might not personally agree with my politics, but, you know, that doesn't mean that we're not going to allow it on the site. And I think that's the mistake. You know, I live in the Silicon Valley, and maybe that's the mistake that Twitter and some of these companies are making, where they are censoring people that disagree with them. Or, you know, you've probably heard, like, David Icke was denied entry into Australia for his documentary that just came out. And whereas in our case, we're welcoming his documentary, we'll have it on the site here very soon. And so we're trying to stand up for the First Amendment and for anti-censorship, but also having, kind of more clear guidelines, I think, for that kind of stuff. And so, there will be communities that we form, and, we've already got a bit of a community within the paranormal world, with viewers or listeners from Fade to Black and other places that have come to the site, and many of the streamers, are within the UFO world. Obviously, we're here at the UFO Congress in Phoenix, and so, we're trying to build a community that's very open-minded about many different things. And that's really our goal, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think a little bit of common sense comes into play here, and cancel culture and some of those issues. That's another conversation for another time, and not really what you're here for. And I want to switch gears right now and talk about your book, The Simulation Hypothesis. It's by Rizwan Virk. Rizwan is his first name, his full name. And this is zenentrepreneur.com is your website. And the tagline at the top is, an MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics agree. We're in a video game. And I know that this isn't a new concept to people who follow this type of content, that we've talked about computer simulations before, or a matrix-like environment that we live in. But I'd like to show the book right here, and that's a copy, and he was so kind to give me one. And let's talk about what inspired you to write this book and the basic gist of it.
Yeah, sure. So, I've been in the video game industry for the past 10 years or so, and so I've seen the fidelity of video games improve significantly. And, just a couple years ago, I was putting on a virtual reality headset, and I was playing a ping pong game with table tennis, and it was so realistic that at the end of the game, I actually put the paddle down on the table. But of course, there was no table, so the controller fell to the floor, and I leaned over on the table, and I almost fell over as well. And that's when I realized that we were getting very good at building technology that seems realistic and that is almost indistinguishable from physical reality. Now, The Matrix came out 20 years ago this year, and I released the book on March 31st of this year, which was the exact 20-year anniversary of when the film was released. And back then, we thought of that as very much as science fiction. But today, there's a pretty serious conversation within academia, with scientists, within the paranormal world as well, that could we literally be living in some type of a simulated reality? And so, I've been thinking about this for a long time, since I was a kid, and I used to watch Star Trek and the holodeck. And I used to wonder what happens to those holodeck characters when the Enterprise cast members aren't there. And there was even one episode where a character who's based on Professor Moriarty from Sherlock Holmes, and he was Data's foil. Data was playing Sherlock Holmes with the hat and everything. He figured out that they were in a simulated world, and some of the characters came from out there. And so, I wrote the book because it's a topic that, I can discuss with mainstream technology people. In fact, I just gave a talk at Google about this just last month, about this idea, and it's a very popular idea because AI is becoming so popular. So anyway, those were some of the influences that led me to write the book.
As part of this concept built upon, I know that there's science that backs this up, we actually have gaps in our perception, and our brain does work to fill in those gaps, to create a continuity of our vision and our thought and our incoming data, when in fact the brain doesn't really physically work that way, and that's a side effect, or perhaps even the function of consciousness, is to sew together those bits of information and create continuity for us. Is that part of the physiology that would apply to this?
Yeah, I think that's part of the physiology that would allow us to think that a simulation is actual physical reality. And what's happened with physics is, as they've looked for matter, they keep opening up things to look for these particles, and they can't really find matter. So matter as such doesn't exist. And there was a physicist named David Bohm in the 60s and 70s who was really well known in the quantum physics world. And, he said that physical reality is more like a river with a bunch of vortices that aren't totally separate, as opposed to these separate balls of particles, right? And so this started to remind me a lot of pixels in a pixelated world. And in fact, there is a smallest measurable distance in quantum physics, which is this idea of the Planck length. And we can't really measure anything below that. So that's kind of like a pixel in the physical world. And then there's also this idea of pixelated time, or a quanta of time. Now that hasn't been proven yet by physics, but it's been postulated, and that would be a lot like what we have in computer science. When we run a program, there's a clock speed that the processor has, and every step of the simulation has to be some multiple of that clock speed. You can't get underneath that clock speed. Now, sometimes a simulation can be thought of as, hey, I'm simulating a population of fruit flies. So every step is like 1 year in the simulation. Or it could be every second, but every game, whether it's World of Warcraft or Fortnite or whatever game you're playing, it has this concept of these periods of time which are a multiple to processor. And so you can only see what happens at each of those steps in time. And so that's one of the areas where I think science is starting to agree. Another area is the observer effect in quantum physics, which is this idea that a particle can be either a wave or a particle, and it's not until it actually gets observed by someone or something that the probability wave collapses down to a single reality. Now, we don't know why that exists, although there have been experiments throughout the 20th century that show that this is a real phenomenon and it actually exists. And coming at it from a video game perspective, looking at it as a video game, the universe is a video game, it makes much more sense, because in a video game, we only render the pixels that your character can see. So if this is a video game and you were looking, your character was looking, you'd only render these pixels and not the pixels behind this curtain, for example, right? So quantum indeterminacy, or the observer effect, starts to look like an optimization technique. And it turns out the reason we can build 3D worlds today, we couldn't back in the 80s. When I started playing video games, it was the Atari system. It was like an 8-bit system, and we played Space Invaders and Pac-Man, but they were very primitive graphics. If you ask anybody back then, can you render a fully 3D world like, one of these games today? The answer would be no. So what happened? We learned optimization techniques along the way. And so by learning about optimization, we're able to only render that which is needed for rendering of the scene. And if you and I are in a scene together with our avatars, I'm rendering it on my laptop or on my phone, and you're rendering it on your phone, which is kind of like the physiology of our consciousness. And so this is where it starts to touch on a lot of other areas, like UFOs, for example.
I was just going right where I was going to ask. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I spent a little bit of time with Jacques Vallée, who has been involved since Project Blue Book with the phenomenon. And one of the things he told me, which really stuck in my mind, was he said there are some UFO sightings where there are two people, one of them sees the UFO and one of them does not. And he said there's a consciousness aspect to the phenomena. There's a physical aspect, but there's also a consciousness aspect. And when I started to think about it from a video game perspective, it made much more sense, because I could literally render the UFO on your screen and not on my screen. My avatar would say there's nothing there, and your avatar would say there's a UFO there. Is it there or not? An information-based approach where we're beaming information to each of our consciousness, makes more sense with a lot of these mysteries. And I was just at a presentation about remote viewing, and there was a lot of research done on remote viewing back in the 1970s at the Stanford Research Institute, right when they were working on the internet there. Right. In the next room, they were doing, psychic experiments with remote viewing. Well, it turns out if we're inside a video game, remote viewing is easily explainable, which is we have something called a virtual camera. And inside, like League of Legends, as a game, you can put the virtual camera at any XYZ coordinate you want, right? And then your character looking at the screen can see what's happening there. And so many things that are unexplained from a material world perspective make more sense when you adopt the model that we're living inside a computer-generated reality.
Okay, I have a question formulated, and I may incorrectly state it in asking it, and that would be due to my ignorance of the scientific principles. But let me see if I understand this and think of another way to have an analogy for this. If that were the basis of reality, and we had a quote-unquote multi-dimensional universe, could we think of it as a series of servers networked together, and then when something on an interdimensional level, quote-unquote, breaks into our reality, like a ghost or a UFO or a cryptid, that is actually a manifestation of content, so to speak, on another server that somehow crosses over into our program and then creates the appearance of something that exists, but then again doesn't maintain a permanent place in this version of our reality, and that's why it's so elusive.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it is, within one virtual server, I can have multiple virtual worlds. So I could have instances of World of Warcraft running, even on the same server or on different servers, and your character might be in one of those servers, and my character might be on another, and they don't normally interact with each other. But really, one way to think about these paranormal phenomena is that they are coming from outside of our virtual world. Now, whether that's another virtual world or it's a base reality that's outside of this physical world. It could be that we're all sitting on an alien server somewhere and they are trying to come in and communicate to us. Think of like the Hunger Games, right? So when they had the Hunger Games, if you remember in the movies, they were inside this kind of contained environment and they could send in gifts, right? Everybody was watching the show from the outside, but they could send in things to the players and they would appear as these little drones from the sky. Now, you could think that maybe perhaps UFOs are coming at us from outside of our reality, and there have been, some people who have had abduction experiences who think that's the case, that they're coming from another dimension and they're interdimensional objects as opposed to simply coming from another planet, within our physical universe. Yeah.
AI in general is a hot topic on shows like Joe Rogan. He gets to bring it up with Elon Musk and other notable scientists. And actually, it's a great honor to have you here on the show, by the way. This is you're the first scientist of this caliber to appear on Mysterious Forces Live, so I'm really glad to have you here. Do you think that AI poses the same dangers that some other people are talking about? Or do you think that we'll kind of go through an infancy and maybe an adolescence with our interaction with artificial intelligence where we'll eventually mature to be able to harness it in a responsible way? Or do you think there's that danger of like a wildfire, somehow AI could spread with dangerous consequences?
Right, so it's kind of the Skynet hypothesis,
Yes.
if you will, right? That the computers will take over because they'll become so smart and they'll reach the point of the singularity where the artificial intelligence is more intelligent than us. And at that point, it'll become more and more intelligent and it'll take over. I'm glad you mentioned Elon Musk. He's actually a big proponent of the simulation hypothesis. And in fact, he has a famous quote where he says that 40 years ago we had Pong, which is the Atari game, which is basically two dots and a rectangle. And today we have 3D virtual worlds, which is funny because my experience with ping pong in the virtual world was what got me really thinking about, this idea that we live inside a simulation. But he was on another podcast recently and they asked him, a guy at MIT asked him, if AGI or artificial general intelligence is developed, what would you ask that AGI? And Elon Musk's answer was, I'd ask him, what's outside the simulation, right? That said, AI is going through different waves. And in the book, I talk about the 10 stages of technology that we would have to develop to get to the simulation point, which is the point at which we can not only create a matrix-like reality, but we can populate it with NPCs, or non-player characters, who are really human. And we're not quite there yet. We don't have AI which has passed the Turing test, which Alan Turing famously in the 1950s called the imitation game, which is this idea that you would have a computer behind one curtain and a human behind another, and you would talk to them, and if you could not tell the difference, then it would have passed the imitation game, or as we say it today, the Turing test. So we're not quite there yet. I don't worry about that as much in the near term, although in the long term, you always have that possibility, because AI has gone through many different waves. So like when I first went to college in the 1980s, the Japanese had been predicting the fifth wave of AI, and they were going to have it by the end of the 80s, and turns out they didn't. So that first wave of AI was all rule-based, heuristic AI, which then we went through an AI winter. In fact, some of the pioneers of today's machine learning algorithms, they just got the award That's like the Nobel Prize of computer science. But when they were doing the research in the 2000s, nobody else was interested in funding them. They were just doing it in somewhere in Canada, I think, is where they were doing it. And so I think we're going to have another AI winter at some point, because today's AI is more based on data and reinforcement learning. And that will only get us so far. And we need to, for a self-driving car, for example, it needs both rules and data. The algorithms don't work if you just use data today. And so eventually you're going to combine the rule sets and the data sets with something else. And we don't know what that something else is yet. So I don't worry that Skynet's going to take over tomorrow, although there was a story recently where some scientists had suggested we put the nuclear weapons in charge of AI in case we get attacked first. That's a dangerous road. And I think once you start going down the autonomous weapons route, that's where there is actually a danger. Now, some people think the danger is when AI becomes too intelligent. I actually think that's not the problem. So I used to study meditation with a teacher, and he was also a black belt, and he said, look, if you're learning and you're going to fight a black belt, you want to fight a 9th level black belt, not somebody who just got his black belt. Why? Because the 9th level black belt knows things so well that he will not hurt you too much. He'll just show you a move. The guy who just got his black belt may not be fully refined and might actually hurt you, with his skill. The same thing might happen is if we put dumb AI in charge of weapons, it might actually hurt us. Whereas if we get really intelligent AI, it probably will see that it's not in its interest to do so. That's my personal take on it, but that's an opinion along with everybody else's opinion.
Right. Do you think that our interaction with technology now, how we're kind of glued into our devices, at least psychologically, how it takes up so much of our attention, Bluetooth, headsets, is this really the first step in human-machine interconnectivity? And are we looking at wetware in the near future? And are we on the precipice of an age of at least maybe voluntarily cyborg existence?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring up. So in my book, I mentioned the 10 stages of technology development. And turns out building something like the Matrix, the resolution isn't really the problem anymore. We've got pretty good resolution. If you watch a movie like Blade Runner 2049 or Star Wars, it's transmitted digitally at 2K. But we've got screens at 4K and 8K pixels, so the resolution is already there. It's the real-time rendering and the brain-computer interfaces. So if you remember in The Matrix, right, Neo woke up, Keanu Reeves, outside the Matrix, and there was a cable that was plugged into his neocortex, right? That's the technology we don't have yet. And there's a lot of work being done in brain-computer interfaces, but it's the reactions, reading our reactions, as well as transmitting information directly into the brain. So I think, we're in the beginning stages of that. So speaking of Elon Musk, there's a company called Neuralink that he has funded, which is starting to make some waves, which is going to be about implanting certain types of chips in the brain. There's also ways to do brain-computer interaction without physically implanting. So there's a gentleman named Adam Curry who used to be at PAIR, the Princeton Advanced Engineering Anomalies Research Institute, and they did research on random number generators, and they found that the mind can actually change random number generators, so it can influence it. And so that's a way to pick up what's happening in your mind without physically intruding. But yeah, I think sadly in some cases, we are at the beginning of that, and there will be more and more companies that are creating interfaces. And then you've got a whole group of people in Silicon Valley who believe that they can have digital immortality by downloading the consciousness into a silicon device. And the first stage of that, guys like Ray Kurzweil at Google and others, first stage of that is in fact this silicon/biological interface. I think the hard part there really is the wetware, right? It's the how do you interface the chemical with the silicon. They operate at very different speeds. And then the bigger questions that come up to play is, what is consciousness, right? There's a famous philosopher at NYU named David Chalmers, and he calls it the hard problem of consciousness, right? And that's why I actually divide the simulation hypothesis into the NPC version and the RPC version. The NPC version, which is what many scientists talk about, we're just in a simulation and we're all AI. They think we just need to have all the neurons simulated, and therefore we will have, passed the Turing test. The RPG version is the role-playing game version, kind of like in the Matrix, where we exist outside the simulation. We also exist inside the simulation. So the consciousness exists, and just like I would play a character inside, League of Legends or Counter-Strike Go, I'm playing this character here, Rizwan Virk, in this virtual reality, which then ties to a lot of the Eastern religious traditions, right? I mean, you don't even have to make an analogy with Buddhism and Hinduism. Right. They talk about consciousness existing outside the physical reality, and when you're born, you download consciousness into that body, you play out that avatar through the life, and you have a series of quests and achievements that you have to make along the way, which is stored as something called karma. And where is karma stored? On some server that we can't see because it's not part of the physical rendered world, and so that ties very much to these bigger questions, I think. But to answer your earlier question, I do think we're going to start having more and more brain-computer interfaces. But I'm in favor of the ones that don't necessarily require putting something in your physical body.
Yeah. I had a question. This is one of those moments I'm so caught up in what he's saying and trying to be a good listener that I'm not formulating a question while I'm listening to him. What was it? I lost it. It's gone. Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to take that as a sign. Rizwan Virk is his name. The name of the book is The Simulation Hypothesis. And once again, the premise is an MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics agree we are in a video game. And I remembered my question. Do you think, is there some kind of an academic embargo, like science and skeptics stand in opposition to metaphysics? Yet, it's a proven scientific fact that consciousness affects the outcome of tests. And do you think that mainstream science avoids the topic of addressing how and why consciousness can affect the outcome of a scientific test? I mean, isn't that at least somewhat indicative of a fact that there is something beyond what we understand about the rules of physics at this point? But that seems to be ignored and marginalized. And I would think that if science were more willing to focus on that and say, okay, we don't know how or why this works, spooky action at a distance, so on and so forth. But that seems to be indicative that there's more at play here than what we can explain in our current scientific language.
I think that most scientists today have adopted a materialist worldview. And it's a paradigm that's very hard to change. I like to use the analogy of meteorites. Scientists at one point thought meteorites didn't exist. And whenever they heard stories about rocks falling from the sky, they said, you're crazy, because that doesn't fit into the currently accepted paradigm. And it's just anecdotal evidence, which is not the same as science. But I think that's kind of where they put a lot of this consciousness stuff, to say that, well, that's just anecdotal evidence. Even with the observer effect, there's within the quantum physics world, they're trying to say, well, it doesn't really require consciousness. It could be a measuring device, right? Or that's where the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics came up, is it doesn't require a collapse of the probability wave, because, in fact, there are lots of parallel worlds out there, and so every possibility is happening everywhere. Each one is a material world. But if you think about, how would you branch out universes so quickly? Every time you had a quantum decision, the only way to do that is if the universes are information-based. But yeah, back to your original question, I do think that many scientists do ignore the role of consciousness. Not all. I mean, Max Planck, who's one of the fathers of quantum physics, he said that he views consciousness as fundamental and matter as derivative. So there are many scientists who agree with that idea that consciousness may exist outside the physical universe. But I think within academia itself, it's not a popular area. I mean, there are many experiments done around remote viewing and other, like this random number generator, where if those same statistical results were applied in any other area, they would be accepted. Right? Russell Targ, who was at the Stanford Research Institute and did a lot of the research there, he says, if you look at the correlations between taking aspirin and heart attacks, doctors will tell you, and I do this, take aspirin every day because it'll help you prevent a heart attack. He said the evidence we have for psychic phenomenon is actually much stronger than that correlation, and yet it's ignored because it doesn't fit the current paradigm. So you almost have to wait till generations of scientists die out before you get the next set of generations of scientists who are more open to these types of things. So I like to say science is slow. It will eventually get there, but they do take a very materialistic point of view. In fact, some of the pushback that I've had to the simulation hypothesis has been more from hardcore scientists saying, that's ridiculous, we don't live inside a video game. Whereas people that are open to these other ideas are very open to that. So anyway, yeah.
Oh, no, I like it. This has been a fascinating conversation. Rizwan Virk, thank you so much for being here. And Bitmovio is the new platform that is an amalgamation of a gaming platform. It's, like you said, YouTube meets Patreon, meets Netflix. There's original content, there's established content on there, and I'm very excited about it. I downloaded their app myself, and I intend on using it, and I think that we all need an alternative to YouTube. I think that YouTube kind of pulled the rug out from underneath individual content creators, and we are powerless to do anything about it. But an open and free market will let consumers and entrepreneurs make decisions and let the market guide us to a platform where we have more adult responsibility for our own content and we don't have some kind of corporate interference or non-human algorithms making strange decisions and marginalizing our content. So Riz, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you on the show. And I'll be talking about your platform more. I'll be using it, and maybe we'll do this again remotely once I get back in my studio. Are there any other places that you're going to be making appearances this year or doing lectures where people can find you?
Yeah, so I mentioned I was at Google about a month ago. I'll be at East West in Mountain View, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then I'll probably be at Contact in the Desert next year and some other places as well. But check out my website, zenentrepreneur.com, or on Facebook. You can do a search for Zen Entrepreneur, and you should be able to find it. And that'll have the latest schedule. And my Twitter is @RizStanford, so you can find me there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Once again, thank you for your time. You could have been doing something else with your time and attention, but you chose to spend it with us, and I always appreciate that. So please like and subscribe if you haven't. Hit the alert bell if you haven't done that already, and please feel free to share these videos, and let's get the word out. I'm trying to get my subscribers up, but if I'm on Bitmovio, I may not need to worry about how many YouTube subscribers I have, and I can worry about bigger things other than that. So I'm hoping that this is the start of that. So thank you for watching, dear viewer, and please look for more videos from the 2019 International UFO Congress right here in Phoenix, Arizona. I appreciate it, and have a good night. Thank you.